Carthage, 2nd century. A man walks through the streets of one of the most powerful cities of the Roman Empire. He is a lawyer, the son of a pagan centurion, educated in the finest schools of rhetoric and philosophy of the ancient world, and he is about to convert to Christianity, a persecuted, despised, illegal sect. What happens next will change the history of the Christian faith forever. This man will create a word that you still repeat today without knowing where it came from. Trinity. 3 persons, 1 substance. The theological formula that defines the Christian God for nearly 2,000 years was born from his mind. But there is a problem. The Church never canonized him. Jerome called him a genius and a heretic. Augustine used his ideas, but listed his name among the condemned. And the most famous phrase attributed to him, "I believe because it is absurd," he never said. Who was Tertullian, the greatest defender of early Christianity, who ended up breaking with the very church he helped to build? The hunter of heretics, who died as one of them. This is the story of the Father of Latin Theology, the man the church needed to use, but could never fully embrace. To understand Tertullian, you must first understand the world into which he was born. We are around the year AD 155. The Roman Empire is at the height of its power. From London to Mesopotamia, from Gibraltar to the Black Sea, Rome controls everything. Paved roads cut across 3 continents. Legions guarantee order. Trade flows freely. The Pax Romana seems unshakable. But there is a problem growing in the shadows. An Eastern religion is spreading like fire through dry straw. Christianity. To the Romans, this Jewish sect is incomprehensible. They worship a crucified criminal. They refuse to sacrifice to the gods of the state. They speak of a kingdom that is not of this world. They meet in secret. They call one another brothers, slaves and senators together as equals. This is dangerous. And Rome knows how to deal with what is dangerous. Persecutions come in waves. Nero had already turned Christians into human torches to light his gardens. Domitian hunted the family of Christ. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, the most enlightened man in Rome, authorized public tortures in Lyon that shocked even pagans. To be a Christian in the 2nd century is not a choice of comfort. It is a potential death sentence. Now look at Carthage. 500,000 inhabitants. The 2nd largest city of the Western Roman world, second only to Rome itself. A strategic port in North Africa. A center of trade in grain, olive oil, and ceramics. A cosmopolitan metropolis where Latin, Greek, Punic, and a dozen African dialects are spoken. Carthage had already been destroyed once, razed by the Romans in 146 BC at the end of the Punic Wars. Hannibal, the general who crossed the Alps with elephants, was Carthaginian. Rome never forgot. They salted the earth, cursed the soil. But a century later, Julius Caesar rebuilt the city, and Carthage was reborn, richer, more influential, more Roman than ever. And it is in this rebuilt Carthage, at this crossroads of cultures and powers, that Quintus Septimius Florens Tertullian is born. His father is a centurion, an officer in the Roman army, probably connected to the provincial governor, a devoted pagan, a man of discipline, order, and hierarchy. The kind of Roman who believes in the ancient gods, in state rituals, in the superiority of Latin civilization. The son receives the best education available: rhetoric, philosophy, law, Greek and Latin literature. Tertullian learns to build arguments the way one builds fortresses. Every word in the right place, every sentence a wall against the opponent. He becomes a lawyer. And not just any lawyer. Some historians believe he is the same Tertullianus, cited in Roman legal codes, a renowned jurist, consulted on complex questions of law. Tertullian knows the system from the inside. He knows how Rome thinks. He knows how Rome condemns. He knows how Rome kills. and that is exactly what will make him so dangerous when he changes sides. But we are not there yet. For now, Tertullian is a brilliant young pagan, ambitious, embedded in the intellectual elite of Carthage. He knows the temples, attends the spectacles, watches gladiatorial games in the amphitheatre, participates in festivals honoring the Roman gods. Years later, he will write about this. He will describe what he saw. He will condemn every detail with the fury of someone who knows sin from the inside. But that comes later. For now, one question hangs in the air. What makes a man like this, wealthy, educated, well-positioned, abandon everything to follow a religion of slaves and fishermen? What did Tertullian see that changed everything? Tertullian's conversion remains shrouded in mystery. He never wrote an autobiography. He never left a detailed account of the exact moment when he abandoned the gods of Rome. What we have are fragments, clues scattered throughout his own writings, indirect references, veiled confessions. But one thing is certain. Something happened around the year AD 195. Tertullian was approximately 40 years old. He was at the peak of his career. Probably married, he mentions a wife in later texts, though he never reveals her name. Established, respected, with a predictable future ahead of him. And then, everything changed. Tertullian himself gives us a clue. Years later, writing about Christians, he would declare, "Fiunt non nascuntur Christiani." Christians are not born, they are made. That sentence carries autobiographical weight. Tertullian knows what he is talking about. He was made a Christian. Something transformed him. But what? The most likely answer is blood. North Africa, at the end of the 2nd century, was on fire. Not with war, but with persecution. Christianity had spread rapidly throughout the African provinces. Carthage, as an urban and commercial center, hosted one of the most vibrant Christian communities outside Rome and Alexandria. And Rome was paying attention. In AD 180, just 15 years before Tertullian's probable conversion, something happened that shook Carthage. The martyrs of Scilly. 12 Christians from a small town called Scilly, in what is now Tunisia, were brought before the proconsul Saturninus. The interrogation was recorded. It is the oldest surviving Latin document of African Christianity. The proconsul offered clemency. All they had to do was swear by the genius of the emperor. A symbolic gesture was enough, a pinch of incense, a word of loyalty. The 12 refused. Speratus, the leader of the group, replied, "I do not recognize the empire of this world. I serve the God whom no man has seen nor can see." They were beheaded the same day. Tertullian was in Carthage when this happened. He was about 25 years old, young but already an adult. He certainly heard about it. Perhaps he witnessed it. Perhaps he saw the bodies. And here is the detail that matters. The martyrs of Scilly were not nobles. They were not philosophers. They were ordinary people, artisans, laborers, simple folk, and they died with a dignity that defied all Roman logic. Why? That question must have lingered in Tertullian's mind for years, but the martyrs of Scilly were only the beginning. In AD 203, a few years after Tertullian's conversion, Carthage witnessed another martyrdom that entered history, Perpetua and Felicity. Vibia Perpetua was a 22-year-old noblewoman, a mother of an infant, educated, refined, exactly the kind of person Tertullian would have known in his social circles. Felicity was her slave, 8 months pregnant when she was arrested. Together, side by side, mistress and slave faced the beasts in the amphitheatre of Carthage. Perpetua's diary survived. She wrote from prison. She described visions. She recorded conversations with her pagan father, who begged her to apostatize. She narrated the moment she nursed her child for the last time before being led into the arena. Tertullian likely knew this story firsthand. Some scholars believe he himself edited parts of the text that reached us. And here is the point. Perpetua was patrician. Felicity was a slave. In the arena, they died as equals. For a Roman, this was incomprehensible. For a Roman searching for something greater than Rome, it was irresistible. Christianity offered something that Roman paganism could not. It was not merely a religion, it was a community. In the Roman world, your identity was defined by birth. Patrician or plebeian, free or slave, citizen or barbarian. These categories were impenetrable walls. But in the catacombs and houses where Christians gathered, those walls collapsed. The slave broke bread with the senator. The redeemed prostitute sat beside the matron. The converted barbarian was called brother by the Roman citizen. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. Paul's words echoed in every Christian assembly. For Tertullian, accustomed to Rome's rigid hierarchy, this must have been revolutionary. But there was more. Christianity also offered answers. Roman philosophy was in crisis. Stoicism preached resignation before an indifferent universe. Epicureanism sought moderate pleasure in an existence without ultimate purpose. Academic skepticism questioned whether truth could even be known. Tertullian knew all these schools. He had read Seneca, Cicero, Plato, Aristotle. He mastered the intellectual canon of the ancient world, and he was not satisfied. Christianity offered certainty. It offered purpose. It offered a God who had entered history, died on a cross, and risen on the third day. This was not a timeless myth like the stories of Zeus and Apollo. It was a historical event, datable, with witnesses, with an empty tomb. The Son of God died. That is believable because it is absurd. And having been buried, he rose again. That is certain because it is impossible. Tertullian was not rejecting reason. He was pointing beyond it. The conversion happened. We do not know the exact day. We do not know whether there was a dramatic moment, a vision, an encounter, a crisis. What we do know is that around AD 195, Tertullian emerges in the historical record as a Christian, and not just a Christian, a militant Christian, a Christian who writes, who argues, who attacks, who defends. The same brilliant mind trained in the courts of Rome now turned against Rome. The same rhetorical techniques once used for imperial law now served the gospel. Tertullian had found his cause, and he would fight for it with a ferocity the ancient world had rarely seen. The Church of Carthage welcomed him. It was an established community with its own structure. Bishops, presbyters, deacons, organized liturgy, sacred texts in circulation, intense theological debates. African Christianity had its own character. It was stricter than Roman Christianity, more uncompromising, more willing to embrace martyrdom. Africa did not produce lukewarm Christians. Tertullian fit perfectly. His legal training was exactly what the church needed. There were questions to resolve, heresies to combat, pagans to answer, emperors to challenge, and there was a language to be forged. Up to that point, Christian theology was predominantly Greek. The great thinkers, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Irenaeus, wrote in Greek. Theological concepts had Greek vocabulary. Christian philosophy drew from Platonic and Stoic sources in the Hellenic tongue. But the West spoke Latin. Rome spoke Latin. Carthage spoke Latin. Africa, Gaul, Hispania, the vast Western world of the empire, thought in Latin. And Christian Latin did not yet exist. There were no words, no technical terms, no way to express in Latin what the Greeks expressed with philosophical precision. Tertullian would change that. He would create Christian Latin. He would invent words. He would forge concepts. He would construct the vocabulary the Western Church would use for the next 2,000 years. But that was still to come. For now, Tertullian was only a brilliant convert in an African church, a man with all the tools, waiting for the right moment to use them. That moment was approaching. Between the years AD 197 and 212, Tertullian wrote without pause. 31 treatises have survived to our day. 31. And historians believe others were lost to the ashes of time. No Latin Christian author before him had produced so much. None had written with such force. None had attacked with such precision. Tertullian did not write to entertain. He wrote to win. Every text was a battle. Every argument a calculated strike. Every page territory conquered for the Christian faith. And he fought on all fronts at once. Against the pagans, he wrote the Apologeticum. It is the year 197. Emperor Septimius Severus has not yet unleashed his most brutal persecutions, but tension is in the air. Christians are viewed with suspicion. Rumors circulate. They are said to practice ritual cannibalism, commit incest in their secret meetings, worship a donkey's head. Tertullian responds with a masterpiece. The Apologeticum is not a plea for mercy. It is not a supplication. It is an attack. Tertullian turns the tables. Instead of defending Christians against Roman accusations, he accuses Rome. You call us atheists because we do not worship your gods. But who are your gods? Saturn devoured his own children. Jupiter was an adulterer. Venus, a prostitute. You worship vices personified and call us impious. The text is brilliant. Every paragraph dismantles a pagan argument. Every line exposes Roman hypocrisy. And then comes the phrase that would echo through the centuries. Semen est sanguis Christianorum. The blood of Christians is seed. The more you kill us, the more we grow. The more you persecute us, the more we multiply. Your violence is our propaganda. Rome had never heard anything like this. But Tertullian did not fight only external enemies. Within the church itself, heresies sprang up like weeds. Marcionites, Valentinians, Gnostics of dozens of varieties, Monarchians, Docetists, each group with its own version of the gospel, each sect with its own interpretation of Christ. Christian orthodoxy had not yet been defined. The ecumenical councils would come only in the following century. There was no universal creed, no official catechism. What existed was a theological battlefield, and Tertullian entered it fully armed. Against Marcion, he wrote 5 devastating books. Marcion was wealthy, a shipowner. He had donated a fortune to the church in Rome before being expelled for heresy. His doctrine was seductive. The God of the Old Testament was a cruel demiurge, different from the loving Father revealed by Jesus. The material world was evil. Salvation was escape from the flesh. Tertullian demolished every argument. Page by page, verse by verse, he showed that the God of Abraham was the same God as Jesus, that creation was good, that the flesh would rise again, that Marcion had mutilated the scriptures to create a convenient gospel. Marcion's Christ is a phantom, Tertullian wrote, a God who did not create, did not judge, did not truly become incarnate. A convenient God, a false God. The Church used these arguments for centuries. When Gnostics resurfaced in medieval forms, Cathars, Bogomils, Albigensians, Catholic theologians returned to Tertullian for ammunition. But it was against Praxeas that Tertullian fought his most important battle. And it was in this battle that he forged the most enduring theological weapon in Christian history. Praxeas was an Asian Christian who arrived in Rome around AD 190. He brought a theology that seemed simple. There is only one God, and that God is Jesus. The Father and the Son are not distinct persons. They are different modes of the same one God's manifestation. It sounds orthodox at first glance. After all, Christians believe in one God. But Tertullian saw the danger immediately. If the Father and the Son are the same person, then it was the Father who died on the cross. The Father suffered. The Father agonized. The Father cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" to himself. That was absurd. And it had a name: Patripassianism. the heresy that the Father suffered the Passion. Tertullian responded with the treatise Adversus Praxean, against Praxeas, and in this text he did something no one had ever done before in Latin. He defined the Trinity. Read carefully. 3 persons, 1 substance. Tres personae, una substantia. Those 5 Latin words define the Christian God to this day, nearly 2,000 years later. Tertullian did not invent the idea of the Trinity. Christians had been baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit since the 1st century. Trinitarian experience existed in liturgy, prayer, and the life of the Church, but no one had found the right words to express it. The Greeks had terms, hypostasis, ousia, prosopon, but these concepts came loaded with Platonic philosophy and ambiguous meanings. Tertullian did something different. He went to Roman law. Persona, in legal Latin, meant an individual with a distinct legal identity. It was not a theatrical mask. It was not mere appearance. It was a subject of rights and actions. Substantia meant that which underlies, the fundamental reality, the essence that remains while accidents change. 3 persons, 1 substance. 3 distinct subjects, 1 single divine reality. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, but the 3 are one God. Tertullian developed this further. He introduced terms such as Trinitas, Trinity. The word appears for the first time in Christian literature in his writings. He explained the relationship between the divine persons using careful analogies. The sun and its ray, the fountain and the river flowing from it, the root and the shoot. The Father is the entire substance, he wrote, but the Son is a derivation and portion of the whole. As he himself declares, the Father is greater than I. There were problematic nuances. Tertullian seemed to subordinate the Son to the Father in ways later councils would reject. His theology was not identical to the Nicene Creed, which would come more than a century later. But the structure was there. The vocabulary was there. The fundamental distinction between person and substance was there. When the bishops gathered at Nicaea in AD 325, they did not start from zero. They started from Tertullian. And there was more. Tertullian not only defined the Trinity, he also defined Christ. Against the Docetists, who claimed that Jesus only appeared to have a physical body, Tertullian insisted on the reality of Christ's flesh. Born, suffered, died, was buried, rose again, in flesh. He used an expression that would become central to later Christology: 2 substances in 1 person. Christ was fully God and fully man. 2 natures united without confusion in a single subject. Does that sound familiar? It should. It is exactly what the Council of Chalcedon would define in 451, more than 2 centuries after Tertullian wrote. The man from Carthage was centuries ahead of his time. But not everything Tertullian wrote was abstract theology. He also involved himself in the practical life of Christians, and his opinions were intense. On Roman entertainment, he wrote De Spectaculis: no amphitheatres, no gladiatorial games, no theatre, no chariot races. All these spectacles were contaminated by pagan rituals, dedicated to false gods, soaked in blood and lust. Human pleasure can be an offense to God, he declared. For Tertullian, there was no neutral entertainment. Either you were worshipping the true God, or you were feeding demons. On women, he wrote De cultu feminarum, and here Tertullian was brutal. Tu es diaboli janua. You are the devil's gateway. Woman, heir of Eve, had introduced sin into the world, had seduced even the angels. She deserved to dress in perpetual mourning, not in jewelry and ornaments. Centuries later, these words would be used to justify all kinds of oppression. Modern evangelical purity culture has roots that reach this far back. But context matters. Tertullian was not attacking female nature itself. He was attacking ostentation, vanity, and conformity to pagan aesthetic standards. At the same time, he exalted female martyrs like Perpetua and Felicity, heroines of unshakable faith. Contradiction? Perhaps. or perhaps a complex man writing in complex times. On military service, his position changed over time. In his early writings, he acknowledged that there were Christians in the legions. "We sail with you and fight with you," he wrote in the Apologeticum. But in later texts, his stance hardened. The Lord, in disarming Peter, disarmed every Christian of the sword. Military service became incompatible with the gospel. A Christian soldier was a contradiction in terms. This radical pacifist vision influenced centuries of debate. To this day, groups such as the Quakers and Mennonites cite arguments that trace back to Tertullian. And then, the question that became a slogan: what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has the academy to do with the church? Tertullian was drawing a line. On one side, Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics. On the other, biblical revelation. For many, this phrase represents anti-intellectualism, blind faith against enlightened reason. But that is a misreading. Tertullian was not ignorant. He had studied philosophy deeply. He used Stoic categories in his theology. He cited Seneca approvingly. What he rejected was not thinking itself, but the subordination of revelation to human speculation. Philosophy could be a tool, but never a master. Truth came from God, not from Athens. And here we must address the phrase, "he never said." Credo quia absurdum. I believe because it is absurd. You will find this quotation in philosophy books, in dictionaries of quotations, in texts by Richard Dawkins attacking religion, in essays by Sigmund Freud analyzing faith as illusion. But Tertullian never wrote this. What he actually wrote in De Carne Christi was different. Certum est, quia impossibile. It is certain because it is impossible. And the context changes everything. Tertullian was arguing against the Marcionites, who denied the physical reality of Christ's death and resurrection. His argument was rhetorical, a technique he learned from Aristotle. The logic was simple. No one would invent a story so improbable if it were not true. The apostles gained nothing by fabricating a crucified Messiah. Crucifixion was shame, not glory. If they wanted to invent a religion, they would invent a victorious hero, not a man condemned to a slave's death. It was a rational argument, not a rejection of reason. The distortion began centuries later. Enlightenment writers such as Voltaire and Bayle wanted to attack Christianity as irrational superstition. Tertullian, with his sharp rhetoric, was an easy target. Twist his words, strip the context, and there you have it. The myth of "I believe because it is absurd." Ironic, isn't it? The man who spent his life constructing rational arguments for the faith was turned into the symbol of blind fideism. By around AD 207, Tertullian was at his peak. He was the most prolific Christian writer in the West, the most cited, the most feared by heretics. The Church of Carthage respected him deeply. Cyprian, who would become bishop and martyr, read his texts daily. He called him the Master. Tertullian had created Latin theology, forged the Trinitarian vocabulary, demolished Marcionites, Gnostics, Monarchians, defended the faith against the empire. Everything was perfect. And then something broke. The man who hunted heretics was about to become one of them. Montanism arrived in Africa as a whisper. It came from Phrygia, a mountainous region in the interior of Asia Minor, present-day central Turkey. It had begun decades earlier, around AD 156, with a man named Montanus. The details about Montanus are scarce. Some say he was a pagan priest of Cybele before converting. Others deny it. What everyone agrees on is that he began to prophesy, and he did not prophesy like the others. Montanus would enter into ecstasy. His voice would change. He spoke in the first person as if he were the Holy Spirit himself. "I am the Father, the Son, and the Paraclete," he would declare in trance. 2 women joined him, Priscilla and Maximilla. They also prophesied. They also entered ecstasy. They also spoke as mouths of the Spirit. The movement grew rapidly. They called themselves the New Prophecy. They believed that the Holy Spirit was pouring fresh revelation upon the Church. revelation that completed what the apostles had taught. What exactly did the Montanists teach? First, that the age of the Paraclete had arrived. The Father had revealed himself in the Old Testament. The Son had revealed himself in the Gospels. Now, the Spirit was revealing himself through the new prophets. Second, that the end was near. Christ would return soon. The New Jerusalem would descend from heaven, and it would descend in Phrygia, specifically in a city called Pepusa. Third, that the church had become too lax. Christians were settling into the world, welcoming penitents back too easily, allowing second marriages, tolerating what should not be tolerated. Montanism was, in essence, a radical charismatic renewal movement. More prophecy, more rigor, more expectation of the end. The institutional church reacted with hostility. Bishops of Asia Minor gathered in synods to examine the new prophecy. Their conclusions were negative. Montanus and his prophetesses were denounced. Followers were excommunicated in various regions. Rome hesitated for a time. There was a moment when the Bishop of Rome almost recognized the movement. Letters of communion were on the verge of being sent, but someone intervened. Someone warned of the dangers. That someone, according to some sources, was Praxeas. Yes, the same Praxeas whom Tertullian opposed in Adversus Praxean. The irony is brutal. Praxeas persuaded Rome to reject the Montanists, and Tertullian never forgave him for it. Praxeas performed a double service for the devil in Rome, Tertullian wrote with venom. He drove out prophecy and brought in heresy. He put the Paraclete to flight and crucified the Father. One sentence, two accusations, hatred compressed into a few words.
But why would Tertullian of all people, be drawn to Montanism? He had spent years fighting heresies. He understood the dangers of doctrinal deviation better than almost any writer of his age. He had every intellectual tool necessary to identify theological error. And yet, he embraced it. Why? The answer lies in temperament. Tertullian was, by nature, a rigorist. Look at his writings. From the beginning he demanded more purity, more discipline, more separation from the world. Christians were not to attend spectacles, not to serve in the army, not to wear jewelry, not to marry again after widowhood. For Tertullian, the church was meant to be a community of saints, not a hospital for sinners. But the real church was not like that. In the early 3rd century, Christianity was changing. Persecution had created an enormous pastoral problem. What should be done with the lapsi, those who had fallen? During waves of imperial violence, many Christians broke. Some offered incense to the gods to escape death. Others purchased forged certificates of sacrifice. Others handed over copies of the scriptures to be burned. When persecution passed, these Christians wanted to return, and the church received them. With penance, yes. With discipline, sometimes. But it received them. To Tertullian, this was scandal. How many times can one sin and be forgiven? He would ask. The church has become a house of spiritual toleration. Montanism offered what Tertullian was looking for. Absolute rigor. No second chance for grave sins. No second marriage, ever. Longer fasts. Harsher discipline. Complete separation from the pagan world. And something more. Montanism offered the Spirit. In Tertullian's view, the institutional church had bureaucratized the faith. Bishops administered, synods debated, structures hardened. But where was the fire? Where was prophecy? Where was the power that had marked the apostles? The Montanists had prophets. They had visions. They had ecstasy. They had supernatural manifestations. For a man who longed for purity and spiritual power, the appeal was irresistible. Around AD 207, the rupture happened. We do not know the details. There is no recorded formal excommunication, no public trial. Tertullian simply shifted. His writings from this period onward carry unmistakable Montanist marks. He begins to defend the authority of the new prophets. He cites Priscilla and Maximilla with approval. He attacks those who reject the new prophecy as carnal, unspiritual, dead within. The hunter of heretics now writes as a member of a sect rejected by the majority church. The irony is devastating.
This is the man who wrote De Prescriptione Hereticorum, the prescription against heretics. In that treatise, Tertullian had established what he presented as the decisive criterion for identifying truth and error: apostolic succession. The churches founded by the apostles, Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, preserved the authentic doctrine. Any teaching that diverged from that tradition was heresy. "Where do you come from?" Tertullian demanded of heretics. "When did you arrive? From which apostolic succession do you descend? Show your credentials." It was a powerful argument. The church would use it for centuries, but now Tertullian stood on the other side. The Montanists had no apostolic succession. Montanus was not a bishop. Priscilla and Maximilla had not been ordained by anyone who could trace a line back to Peter or Paul. The new prophecy was exactly the kind of novelty Tertullian himself had taught people to reject. How did he justify the contradiction? With the Spirit. Tertullian argued that the Paraclete could bring new revelation, that the church was dynamic, not static, that God continued to speak, and whoever had ears to hear, heard. "Discipline progresses," he wrote. "The Paraclete leads us into all truth, as the Lord promised." It was a dangerous argument. If the Spirit could reveal new truths through contemporary prophets, what stopped anyone from claiming divine inspiration for any doctrine whatsoever? Where was the limit? The institutional church knew exactly where it led. Chaos, fragmentation, 1,000 sects, each with its prophet, each with its exclusive revelation. That is why the bishops rejected Montanism. And that is why Tertullian, in embracing it, placed himself outside the majority communion. Some scholars try to minimize the rupture. David Wilhite, for example, argues that Tertullian never made a complete shift into Montanism, that African Montanism differed from the Asian version, more moderate, more orthodox on fundamental doctrines, that Tertullian remained Trinitarian, remained anti-Gnostic, remained committed to the same essential truths. There is truth in that. Tertullian did not abandon the Trinity. He did not embrace Christological heresies. He did not deny the resurrection of the flesh. But joining a movement condemned by the majority church was, in itself, a problem, and Tertullian did not stop there. According to Augustine, writing 2 centuries later, Tertullian eventually broke even with the Montanists. He formed his own group, the Tertullianists, a sect within a sect, a schism within a schism, believers so rigorous that even the Montanists were not pure enough for them. Augustine mentions that there was a Tertullianist basilica in Carthage as late as the early 5th century, 200 years after Tertullian. That group eventually reconciled with the Catholic Church and surrendered its property. But the fact remains, Tertullian died outside communion. The greatest apologist of Latin Christianity ended as the leader of a tiny sect. The final years are obscure. We do not know when he died. Jerome says he lived to an extremely advanced age, which could mean 80, 90 years. If he was born around 155 and died very old, he may have reached AD 220, 230, perhaps later. We do not know how he died. There is no record of martyrdom, no hagiography, no cult. We do not know where he is buried. No basilica was built over his bones. No pilgrim visited his tomb. Tertullian simply disappears from the sources. The man who wrote 31 treatises, who defined Christian vocabulary, who fought dozens of heresies, that man vanished into the fog of history. And the church he helped to build moved forward without him. But not without his words. That is the final paradox. The church rejected Tertullian. It never canonized him. It listed him among heretics. It avoided speaking his name in official contexts. But it used everything he created. Trinity. 3 persons, 1 substance. 2 natures in 1 person. Old Testament and New Testament. The blood of martyrs is seed. Every time a Christian recites the creed, He is using the theology Tertullian articulated. Every time a theologian speaks of persona and substantia, he is using the vocabulary Tertullian forged. The heretic shaped orthodoxy. The condemned man defined the faith.
The Church had a problem. Tertullian was dead. His sect was fading. The Tertullianists were a tiny group, irrelevant in the larger scheme of an expanding Christianity. But his books kept circulating. 31 treatises, thousands of pages. The most brilliant arguments ever written in Latin against pagans, Gnostics, Marcionites, Monarchians. The most precise theological vocabulary available in the West. What was to be done with all of it? Burn it? Impossible. The texts were too good, too necessary. No one else had written anything comparable. Embrace it? Also impossible. The author was a heretic. To cite Tertullian approvingly would be to legitimize Montanism. So the Church chose a third path. It used everything, credited nothing. Cyprian is the perfect example. Bishop of Carthage beginning in AD 248, a generation after Tertullian. Martyred in 258, beheaded during the persecution under Valerian. A saint still venerated today by Catholics, Orthodox, and Anglicans. Cyprian read Tertullian every day. Jerome records the habit. Whenever Cyprian wanted to study, he would say to his secretary, "Da mihi magistrum," bring me the master. The master was Tertullian. Cyprian absorbed his theology, his rhetoric, his vision of the Church. Cyprian's treatises are unthinkable without Tertullian. The influence is on every page. But there is a revealing detail. In all of Cyprian's surviving writings, he never once mentions Tertullian by name. Not once. The master is used, studied, imitated, and silenced. Jerome was more explicit. Writing at the end of the 4th century, he compiled De Viris Illustribus, a catalogue of important Christian writers. Tertullian received an entry. And what an entry it was. Quid Tertulliano eruditius? Quid acutius? Who is more learned than Tertullian? Who more acute? Jerome recognized the genius. He admired the intelligence. He cited the texts frequently in his own works. But in the same paragraph came the condemnation. Tertullian was a presbyter of the Church until middle age, when the envy and insults of the Roman clergy drove him to Montanism. Jerome tried to explain the fall. He blamed Rome, not Carthage. He suggested that Tertullian had been pushed into heresy by mistreatment. It was a generous explanation, perhaps too generous. But the conclusion was relentless. In Tertullian we praise the genius, but we condemn the heresy. That sentence defined the Church's official posture for centuries. Genius, yes. Saint, never. Augustine was even more complicated. The Bishop of Hippo, the greatest theologian of the West after Paul, the man who shaped Catholic and Protestant thought for 1500 years, had an ambiguous relationship with Tertullian. On the one hand, Augustine explicitly listed him among the heretics. In De Heresibus, his catalogue of doctrinal errors, the Tertullianists appear as a separate sect, distinct from the Catholic Church. On the other hand, Augustine absorbed Tertullian's ideas without acknowledging him. The doctrine of original sin, which Augustine developed in his debates against Pelagius, has roots in Tertullian. The theology of grace that dominated the medieval West drank from the same sources. And the Trinitarian formula? Augustine refined it, expanded it, and made it more sophisticated. But the foundation was Tertullian's. The heretic undergirded the saint. The Council of Nicaea took place in AD 325. 318 bishops, the number is traditional, perhaps symbolic, gathered in the city of Nicaea, summoned by Emperor Constantine. The central issue was Arius and his doctrine that the Son was a creature, not co-eternal with the Father. The council condemned Arius. It proclaimed that the Son was homoousios, of the same substance as the Father. Substance. Substantia in Latin, ousia in Greek. Where did that term come from?
Who introduced it into the Christian theological vocabulary? Tertullian, more than a century earlier. The bishops of Nicaea did not cite Tertullian. They did not acknowledge the debt, but they used the conceptual framework he had built. 3 hypostases, 3 persons, 1 ousia, 1 substance. The Nicene formula is Tertullian translated into Greek and raised to ecumenical dogma. The same thing happened at Chalcedon. The year 451. Another council, another Christological crisis. This time the question was how Christ's 2 natures, divine and human, relate to one another. Eutyches taught that the natures fused into one. Nestorius seemed to divide them too sharply. The council proclaimed the formula that became orthodox. Christ is one person in 2 natures, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. One person, 2 natures, una persona, duae substantiae. The language is Tertullian's. The Christology he had sketched in Decane Christi and Adversus Praxean, 250 years earlier, arrived at Chalcedon as official doctrine. No one mentioned his name.
The Middle Ages inherited this ambiguity. Monks copied Tertullian's treatises in scriptoria across Europe. The texts were too useful to lose. Arguments against Gnostics served against Cathars. Defenses of the resurrection of the flesh answered medieval dualists. But scribes knew who the author was. Some manuscripts include marginal notes warning about Montanist heresy. Others simply omit biographical information. The text mattered. The man, not so much. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, cites Tertullian occasionally, but cautiously. The Doctor Angelicus knew he was handling problematic material. The Protestant Reformation brought re-evaluation. Luther and Calvin read the Church Fathers with critical eyes. They sought precedents for their doctrines. They wanted to show that the Reformation was not innovation, but a return to the sources. Tertullian was useful and dangerous at the same time. Useful because he attacked ecclesiastical laxity, denounced accommodation to the world, demanded purity and discipline. Dangerous because his trajectory, from defender of orthodoxy to schismatic, was a warning. Where did legitimate zeal end and destructive sectarianism begin? The Reformers never resolved that tension. The Enlightenment brought another distortion. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Diderot, and Bayle wanted to demolish Christianity as irrational superstition. Tertullian seemed an easy target. His passionate rhetoric, his sharp one-liners, his apparent contempt for Greek philosophy, all of it could be weaponized against the faith. That is how the myth of credo quia absurdum was born. Tertullian never wrote those words, but Enlightenment writers invented them, attributed them to him, and used them as proof that Christianity demanded the abandonment of reason. The irony is bitter. Tertullian, who had spent his life constructing rational arguments, who mastered Aristotelian logic, who debated with legal precision, was turned into the symbol of blind fideism, a slander that persists to this day. And what about the official Roman Catholic Church? Rome never rehabilitated Tertullian. There is no liturgical feast in his honor, no canonization, no basilica bearing his name. He does not appear in the calendar of saints. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, published in 1992, cites Tertullian exactly once, a single reference in nearly 3,000 paragraphs. Compare that with Augustine, dozens of citations. Thomas Aquinas, even more. Even Origen, another problematic author, appears more often than Tertullian. The silence is eloquent. The Church uses his words. It avoids his name. Why was he never canonized? 3 main reasons. First, Montanist heresy. No matter what he wrote before, joining a condemned movement permanently stained his reputation. Saints do not end their lives in sects. Second, certain specific doctrines. Tertullian held positions that later councils rejected. His subordinationism, the idea that the Son is somehow inferior to the Father,
foreshadowed elements of Arianism. His view of second marriages was too rigorous even by Catholic standards. Third, temperament. Tertullian was combative, sarcastic, merciless with opponents. He called adversaries scorpions and vipers. He mocked, ridiculed, humiliated. Saints can be firm, but from them the Church expects a measure of sweetness, charity, gentleness, qualities Tertullian never displayed. He was a genius. He was not a saint, and the Church knows the difference. The result is one of the strangest paradoxes in religious history. The man who contributed most to Western Christian theology before Augustine was never officially recognized by the institution he helped to shape. His words are everywhere, his name almost nowhere. The Trinitarian vocabulary used by billions of Christians was born in Carthage, in the mind of a converted lawyer who died leading a sect of dissidents. 3 persons, 1 substance. Every time a Catholic recites the Creed, he is using Tertullian. Every time a Protestant affirms the Trinity, he is echoing Tertullian. Every time an Orthodox Christian defends the 2 natures of Christ, he is repeating Tertullian. And none of them know it. That is the fate of the heretic who invented the Trinity. Condemned in life, used after death, forgotten in name, present in every word. The Church never forgave him, but it never managed to stop using him. 2,000 years later, Tertullian still does not rest in peace. His ghost haunts debates he could never have imagined. His words are quoted in contexts he would not recognize. His name appears in culture wars fought on continents the Romans did not even know existed. The heretic of Carthage refuses to stay in the past. In March 2025, a study by Arizona Christian University shook the American evangelical world. The numbers were shocking. Only 11% of American adults say they believe in the Trinity as historically defined. Among Christians who attend church regularly, the number rises, but only to 16%. 16%. That means the vast majority of American Christians, people who identify as followers of Jesus, who go to church on Sundays, who read the Bible, do not understand or do not accept the central doctrine of historic Christianity. Researcher George Barner commented on the results with alarm. The Trinity is not a minor detail. It is the foundation. It is what distinguishes Christianity from Judaism, from Islam, from any other monotheistic religion, and most American Christians do not believe it. The irony is brutal. Tertullian spent his life articulating this doctrine. He created the vocabulary. He forged the formulas. He fought heretics who denied it. And nearly 2,000 years later, heresy has won. Not officially, not in the creeds, not in the catechisms, but in the minds and hearts of millions of people who call themselves Christians. The monarchians Tertullian fought, those who fused Father and Son into a single person, are an institutional minority. But their simplified theology dominates popular piety. Praxeas lost the debate in the 3rd century, but he won the culture in the 21st. Meanwhile, the sentence Tertullian never said keeps circulating. Credo quia absurdum. Type those words into any search engine. You will find thousands of results. Philosophy books, academic articles, YouTube videos, social media posts. Richard Dawkins, the most famous atheist biologist in the world, cites the phrase in The God Delusion as proof that religious faith is irrational by definition. The Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy attributes the line to Tertullian without qualification. University intro philosophy courses teach it as a classic example of fideism, the position that faith does not need reason and might even be better without it. All based on an invented quotation. In 2019, a study published in the journal Church History by Cambridge University Press documented the fraud in meticulous detail. The author traced the origin of the myth. He showed how Enlightenment writers, Voltaire, Bale, and others, twisted Tertullian's words to attack Christianity.
What Tertullian actually wrote was a sophisticated argument using Aristotelian rhetorical techniques. The crucifixion and resurrection were credible precisely because no one would invent something so improbable. It was logic, not the abandonment of logic, but the truth did not matter. The myth was too useful. For atheists, it proved Christians were irrational. For certain Christians, it validated a faith that does not need arguments. Everyone had an interest in keeping the lie alive, and so it remains.
In Israel, scholars are examining another aspect of Tertullian, an aspect the Church prefers not to discuss. Adversus Judaeos, against the Jews. Written around AD 200, this treatise is considered the first anti-Jewish polemic in the Latin language. The text that inaugurated a literary tradition spanning 2,000 years. Dr. Stephanie Binder of Bar Ilan University has studied the connections between Tertullian and rabbinic literature. Her work reveals surprising parallels between Tertullian's writings on idolatry and the Mishnah, parallels that suggest mutual knowledge, tense dialogue, porous boundaries between communities. But the main legacy is darker. David Ephraimson of Temple University catalogued references to Jews in Tertullian's writings, 80 passages in 19 treatises, 130 different accusations, Jews portrayed as blind, obstinate, rejected, guilty. Ephraimson's conclusion is disturbing. The road from here to Auschwitz is long and may not be direct, but it is possible to get there starting from here. This does not mean Tertullian is responsible for the Holocaust. History does not work like that. There is no straight line from a 3rd century treatise to 20th century gas chambers. But ideas have consequences. Tertullian did not invent Christian anti-Judaism. He inherited it from earlier texts, some of them in the New Testament itself, but he systematized it. He gave it rhetorical shape. He created arguments that would be repeated for centuries. John Chrysostom would echo Tertullian. Augustine would absorb his categories. Medieval theologians would build on his foundations. The Adversus Judaeos tradition, against the Jews treatises written by church fathers, has in Tertullian one of its pillars. That is part of the legacy. It cannot be ignored. And then there is the question of women. Tu es diaboli janua. You are the devil's gateway. That line from Tertullian echoes across the centuries. It surfaces in contemporary debates about gender, religion, and power. American evangelical blogs discuss purity culture, the movement of the 1990s and 2000s that placed on women the responsibility for male chastity. T-shirts said, "Modesty is hottest." Purity balls celebrated daughters' virginity. Sermons warned about the dangers of female temptation. Critics draw direct lines back to Tertullian. The idea that woman is by nature a temptress, that her body is dangerous, that she must hide to protect men, all of that has patristic roots. And Tertullian is often cited as the source. Is that fair? Partly. Tertullian really did write harsh things about women, but he also praised female martyrs like Perpetua and Felicity. And the Montanism he embraced made room for prophetesses. Priscilla and Maximilla were leaders of the movement. The reality is more complex than either side of the modern debate admits. But the line remains, and it wounds. The debate about faith and reason also continues. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Tertullian asked that question nearly 2,000 years ago. It has never been answered in a satisfying way. Christian universities still debate what the relationship should be between theology and secular philosophy. Seminaries still argue whether the faith needs rational apologetics or whether proclamation is enough. Churches split between intellectualism and emotionalism. Tertullian is invoked by every side. Anti-intellectuals quote him as a defender of simple faith against philosophical arrogance. Apologists respond that Tertullian himself was deeply philosophical, that his question was rhetorical, not literal. The debate goes on, with no resolution in sight, and there is something even more contemporary. Montanism, The movement that drove Tertullian to rupture has unsettling modern parallels. Think of charismatic movements that emphasize contemporary prophecy. Think of churches that claim to receive direct revelation from the Spirit beyond the Scriptures. Think of leaders who speak in God's name, who prophesy, who enter ecstasy. The pattern is ancient. I am not saying every charismatic movement is Montanist, but the tensions are the same. Continuing revelation versus a closed canon, spirit versus institution, prophet versus bishop. Tertullian chose the spirit over the institution, and he ended in a sect. Is it a warning? An example? That depends on who tells the story. The question that remains is simple and devastating. How do you evaluate a man like this? Tertullian was a genius, there is no doubt. His contribution to Christian theology is incalculable. Without him, there would be no Trinitarian vocabulary in Latin. There would be no formulas defining the faith of billions, but he was also sectarian, an extreme rigorist, unable to tolerate imperfection, so pure that no one, not even the Montanists, was pure enough for him. He was a defender of the faith and a destroyer of unity, a builder of orthodoxy and the father of schism, all at the same time. The institutional church never knew what to do with him. It used his ideas, it avoided his name, it absorbed his theology, it rejected his memory. It is a pragmatic solution, perhaps the only possible one, but there is something unsettling in it. If Tertullian were alive today, would he be welcomed in the churches that use his words? Would he be accepted in denominations that recite creeds built on his concepts? Or would he, once again, be pushed to the margins, too difficult, too pure, too inconvenient?
Tertullian's story is a mirror. It shows what happens when zeal outruns charity, when purity becomes an idol, when the pursuit of absolute truth destroys the communion it was meant to protect. It also shows what happens when institutions use people and then discard them, when the church absorbs ideas and silences authors, when convenience replaces gratitude. There are no pure heroes in this story, no absolute villains, only human beings, brilliant and flawed, wrestling with questions we still have not answered. Tertullian died nearly 2,000 years ago, but the questions he raised are still alive. What is orthodoxy? Who decides? Can the Spirit speak beyond the Scriptures? Can the Church err? Is purity worth more than unity? He did not answer these questions, neither have we. If the Church can use a man's ideas for 2,000 years, but never recognize him as a saint, who was really right? Tertullian, who sought absolute purity, or the Church, which chose to survive? Reflect, comment, share,